Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. In this episode, I am very happy to bring the conversation I had with Jaap de Roode. Jaap is a biologist and professor of biology at Emory University. He has a master's in population biology and a PhD in evolutionary biology. He is currently interested in the ecology and evolution of infectious disease and studies infectious diseases in monarch butterflies, honeybees, and humans. With that research interest, he has taken all of it and put it into a wonderful book entitled Doctors by Nature: How Ants, Apes, and Other Animals Heal Themselves. And I wanted to get him on to talk about this. Of course, I've had many people on the podcast that have talked about different aspects of animals that we share the planet with. Animals are always lots of fun to think about, to have as pets when we're in the wild. And so it's really, really nice to have him on to see what animals are up to in the wild, and even some domesticated animals, of how they're able to heal themselves kind of naturally. When we get sick, we usually go to a doctor and we get some meds. They can't do that. And so it was very, very, very fascinating to read all about the different animals and how they try to heal themselves. We talk about whether animals intentionally or unintentionally seek out medicinal plants. We talk about ways that they fight infection. We talk about his research with monarch butterflies and how they treat against parasites. Chimps and how they maintain their gut health. We also talk about birds using cigarettes in their nests, which I thought was one of the most fascinating things in the book. Ants and resin, goats and sheep having preferences, why cats and dogs eat grass. As I say in the conversation, my own animals have done this, so it's very fascinating to read about potentially why, and many other topics. And this was a fun one. I really, really enjoyed this conversation and learning a little bit more about the animals around us. Of course, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. So if you're over there, please subscribe. I know some of you follow. Subscribing helps very much, so please do that. I'm also on YouTube. You can find me there. If you like this episode, I guarantee you there's many other episodes in this sort of world. So look at the back catalog, share with your friends. And now I bring you Jaap de Roode. I am here with Jaap de Roode. Excuse me if I mispronounce that. That's my best effort. Jaap, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm greatly looking forward to talking with you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes. Well, you've written a really, really lovely book. It's out through the wonderful Princeton University Press. That book is Doctors by Nature: How Ants, Apes, and Other Animals Heal Themselves. Mm-hmm. And I have to say, the title, or definitely the subtitle, and the cover, of course, Princeton always has nice covers, was very, very appealing and attractive, and I was very, very interested. And I was not disappointed. I really, really enjoyed reading this book, kind of giving us a tour through the animal kingdom, and not only telling us about how animals can heal themselves or make attempts, but also lessons humans can learn. It's not a very human-centered book, which I like. There's enough of that. But it does have a lot of elements of what humans can learn from animals and what they teach us. So we'll talk about probably not all of the animals, but maybe many of them. Before we get into all of that, why don't you tell listeners who you are professionally, academically, and all the relevant things?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for the nice words. And I'm happy that you enjoyed reading the book. And yes, I'm actually originally from the Netherlands. I'm a biologist, and I did my PhD research at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. And then I moved to the United States in 2005. And since 2008, I have been working at Emory University in Atlanta. And a lot of my research focuses on parasites and infectious diseases, and I mostly study those in monarch butterflies. And doing research on monarch butterflies allowed me to discover that monarchs can use medication. From there, I became really excited about the idea of animals using medication, and that resulted in this book eventually.
Yeah, it's when you read a lot of books, especially when the ones that are that kind of come out in press, you start to notice things. So I'll notice when books don't have a subtitle. That's always very interesting. But your book also has something interesting. No prelude, no introduction. We just go bang straight into the first chapter. I love it. It's great because it's 14 short chapters, and we just get right into it. There's no all those things. It's just right into it, and it's cool because you introduce us to the ideas through the examples of some of the, with the monarch butterflies and with others, bees, things like that. So it's really, really nice how you just kind of get us to jump in there.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I will say I had a group of graduate students here at Emory who were kind of my bouncing board, and they read multiple versions of the book and gave me feedback. And a few of them said, oh, when a book has an introduction, I never read it. It's like, oh, well, then I better not have one. And like you said, just jump right in. And also I try to keep it short enough so that it's not so easy to lose attention. I find often myself when I read books that are really long, that, the first 2/3, I get that. And then it just kind of becomes long. So I was happy with kind of the short chapters and getting to the point.
It works great. It's even nice for me. I love, big books and really, really, dense books, but it's also nice to get a good break from that too. And that's what this does, where everything's, it's just really to the meat of things. Nothing's kind of, I don't think really sacrificed. It's really, really good content. It was all new information for me, so it was nice. But yeah, it's also interesting too. Some people just read the introduction and then they don't read the rest of the book because it's like, I got basically the overview. I'm good, and so they'll do that. So yeah, no introduction. I love it. So one of the things you talk about in the first chapter is you talk about this idea of animals healing themselves. Now, I'm sure we'll talk about it, throughout the conversation, but maybe we can kind of get the 30,000-foot view here. I guess the thing that most interests me in reading all of the different examples you give, and you give examples from, like I said, all over the animal kingdom as a sample here. You're talking about birds, bees, butterflies, chimps, beetles, birds, ants, dogs, cats, elephants. So we go all over the place. But how much do scientists know or biologists know if animals are actively or consciously, or is it more indirect in trying to heal themselves? So if an animal gets a cut or there's something going on with them, maybe even internally, as far as we know, a conscious effort, or is it just kind of by accident? Like, oh, if I chew on this plant or if I use this, I will, have less pain. What do we know, I guess, about the intentionality, which is, I guess, an impossible question to answer. But what do we know, I guess, or as best we can know about whether animals are actively trying to heal themselves?
Yeah, so I think the intentionality is actually really important. And that is one of the ways that we distinguish medical behaviors by animals from other behaviors that could be accidental, right? So an animal could be eating something that happens to be medicinal and that happens to help them against a particular disease, against a particular parasite. But when we talk about animal medication and where animals really use medicines, where they use drugs to either relieve symptoms or cure themselves of parasites or pathogens, whether that's worms, whether that's bacteria or viruses, that intentionality is actually important. And so oftentimes what we do is we observe or we do an experiment and we see that an infected animal, an animal that has an infection with a parasite or a pathogen, changes the behavior, starts eating or applying a medicinal substance, and then actually recovers. So that's really important. However, having said that, intentionality doesn't mean that the animal knows what they're doing, right? So what you're seeing is like you see a change in behavior that helps the host, but the animal doesn't have to be aware exactly of what they are doing. And, and I think that's actually one of the things that has stood in the way of our understanding of animals using medicine, that a lot of people have this idea, kind of think about how do we use medicine, right? I'm sick, I'm going to the doctor, they have studied, they know what to do, and I get a prescription, then I use the medicines, I get better, right? That's really that kind of conscious effort that is involved there But that is not how most animals do it, right? And it's actually also not how we do a lot of things, because there's a lot of things that we do without realizing it, where our bodies tell us that we need specific things. We may be craving salt, or we may be craving particular nutrients when we're sick. We have all been sick, and when you're sick, your taste changes, right? There's specific things you want to eat, other things you don't want to eat. And so that's not conscious. That's our bodies telling us what to do. Another example I often give is pregnant women, right? When they are pregnant and they start eating things that they normally wouldn't eat, or avoiding other things that they normally would eat, it's not conscious. It's their body telling them, you need to eat this. The developing fetus needs this, or your body needs it to nourish that fetus. And so there is a lot of those things that happen. And so that's how we think animals do it. So some animals, they're infected, they change their behavior, they change their taste, start eating medicine. Other animals learn from their associations. So they're sick, they're eating something, they recover, and so then they associate that particular thing with that recovery. And then animals can learn from each other as well. And we see that, for example, in chimpanzees, we see it in sheep as well, where animals learn from each other, they copy each other's behaviors, and then they can start making those individual associations and learn in that way. So all of those things can happen.
I think maybe it's somewhere in the book, I can't remember, you talk about some type of associative learning that can happen, which is really interesting. From my perspective, I know about that in humans, right? It's kind of behaviorism 101 of sorts, but yeah, so I'm sure we'll come on to that a bit later. So it's really interesting to see that kind of link there. You talk about 4 ways: prophylaxis, therapeutic medication, body anointing, and fumigation. These are the 4 ways you identify that how animals fight infections and alleviate disease. Could you just talk about those 4 ways? Why those 4 ways, and kind of some of the decision tree, if you will, of how to choose one more than the other, or what the interaction is between those.
Yeah, so exactly. So I think one of the nice things is when we think about these 4 ways of medication, they're very familiar to humans. So when we start with therapeutic medication, that's the kind of medication where you are sick, you're experiencing illness, and then you use a medicine to relieve those symptoms, right? And so we do that when we're sick. We're taking medicine, we take particular pills, and they make us better. That's what animals do too. So for example, chimpanzees, they're sick with parasitic worms. They start eating very bitter, toxic plants, and that kills the parasites, so then they become better. Prophylaxis is a different type of medication that is kind of preventative medication. So, a nice analogy in humans is, say we are traveling to a place where there's a lot of malaria. You start taking anti-malarial medicine on the off chance that you're going to get infected, which in some places is really high. So you start taking it even before you travel, and you keep on taking it because the chances of infection are high. So animals can do this too. So we know that there's actually a lot of primates that eat all sorts of leaves and plants that help against infections. And so you often see animals starting to use particular medicinal plants during seasons when there are more risks of infection. So for example, you think about the tropics, the wet season, that's when there's more mosquitoes. Mosquitoes spread all sorts of diseases. And that's when you see animals starting to eat more of some of the toxic plants that can be, you see, for example, in baboons. Baboons eat more toxic berries in areas where there's more schistosome parasites. And so that is kind of like this preventative measure. Then there's anointing, and that is really kind of putting stuff on your own body, right? And so the term anointing gets used in religious practices, and also in kind of the monarchy in England, for example. It's a big ceremony. But animals and us, we do this too. So animals often smear things on their fur or on their feather if they're birds. And so you can think of monkeys taking lemons or even the juices, the toxic juices of millipedes, and rubbing that into their own skin. And that keeps parasites such as mosquitoes away. And then the final one is fumigation. And of course, we have similarities in humans as well. So when we try to control mosquitoes And this gets done in a lot of places around the world. You go into a house, spray a lot of insecticides, basically a cloud of insecticides trying to get rid of mosquitoes. And so animals do this too. And so birds, for example, put aromatic plants in their nests, and that keeps ectoparasites away. And ants and bees put sticky stuff from trees in their nest that keeps all sorts of things away, such as viruses and bacteria. So so those are the four things. And again, in terms of using substances, those are really big similarities between animals and humans. Of course, humans are animals, but animals as in, non-human animals.
Right.
And so we have those similarities. And so it makes sense. It makes sense that if we're doing it, that animals do it too.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. I think some of the kind of lessons of sorts for humans is from reading the book is, there's again, I'm not saying anything about, taking, vaccines and prescription medications and all that stuff. That stuff's great. We should do that. I'm not against that. But there is a lot of things in the natural world that animals use all the time and that humans can also use as well. So a kind of a mix or a hybrid. And so animals or non-human animals have a lot to teach us.
Yeah.
So monarch butterflies, this is kind of your wheelhouse. Talk about the parasite OE and how these butterflies seek out these medicinal plants to reduce infection, relieve disease symptoms. Again, I know this is kind of your research area. You kind of started the book that way, so I'll give you as much runway as you want on here, since this is your kind of your thing. So, but tell us about it. It's very fascinating. I was really impressed with it.
And I started the book at a Monarch Butterfly Festival in Florida, and it's great. I love monarch butterflies, and people love monarch butterflies, and so they're actually a really great system if you're studying science, to explain science to people, because people want to learn about monarch butterflies. Butterflies.
Where is this festival in Florida?
It's in St. Mark's, just south of Tallahassee.
Oh, okay. When I was in Key West many years ago, there's a huge butterfly museum that's down there in Key West. And they have so many butterflies. I wonder if it's just a regional thing, is it a warm climate or something? But it's really fascinating to know that there are many down there in Florida. But it's wild to see.
Yeah. And what happens in St. Mark's is that during the fall, the monarchs come through there as they're migrating from the United States and Canada down to central Mexico. And this is what makes monarch butterflies so famous, that they undertake this massive migration where they fly more than 3,000 miles, all the way from southern Canada, all the way to central Mexico. And then they stay there for several months to overwinter, to survive the winter. And then they mate in the early spring and start migrating north again. So the Monarch Butterfly Festival we go to, that is where the monarchs come through the fourth weekend of every October. And there's always monarchs flying through there. Beautiful spot.
I'm sure.
So that's what monarchs are famous for. It's not why I started studying monarchs. And I started studying them because they become sick. I actually did my PhD research on malaria parasites. And I did that mostly in laboratory mice as well as mosquitoes. But then I became really interested in studying parasites in a system that I could do field work, but also do things in the lab. And so monarch butterflies turn out, they have this parasite called, you mentioned it earlier, OE. So the scientific name is Ophriocistis electroscira. It's a very big mouthful. That's why people call it OE. And it's actually very common in monarchs. So historically, if you looked in North America, maybe 1 in 100 butterflies had the parasite. And now it's about 1 in 10. So it's really very, very common. And it's also a very detrimental parasite. So when monarchs are infected, sometimes they cannot come out of their chrysalis. So they kind of get stuck during their metamorphosis. If they do come out fine, they don't live as long, they don't mate as well, and also they don't fly as well. And so this is a really important aspect for an animal that flies, and especially flies all the way from, northern states and Canada down to Mexico. It's like, running a marathon while you're sick. And so you actually see a lot of monarchs that have the parasites don't make the migration. They die on the way. So that's a parasite that brought me to monarchs. And then I became interested in the milkweeds And so milkweeds are the plants that monarch caterpillars use as their only food. So the caterpillars can only eat milkweeds. But there are multiple species of milkweeds, and some of those are more toxic than others. So milkweeds contain chemicals called cardenolides. And when they have more of them, they're more toxic. And milkweeds are toxic to most animals, including us. They're not toxic to, well, mostly not toxic to monarchs that have evolved resistance. And but then it turns out when we did experiments and we looked at monarchs that were reared on more toxic milkweed and less toxic milkweed, that they actually suffered less disease than when they were reared on the more toxic milkweed. And so that means that these toxins act medicinally, and the monarchs actually benefit when they're eating this medicinal milkweed. And so that was really the first step. And from there, the question was, can monarchs actually then intentionally use medicinal milkweed when they need it? And that's when we did experiments, first with caterpillars, giving caterpillars a chance to eat either of the two species. And we didn't find any differences between infected and unaffected caterpillars. But then we said, well, in nature, it's really the mothers that decide what their caterpillars are going to eat, because they're the ones that lay their eggs on milkweed. The caterpillars come out of the egg, start eating the milkweed that their moms chose. And so then we did experiments with infected and uninfected female butterflies that were laying eggs, and found that the infected butterflies lay more of their eggs on the more medicinal milkweed. And so what that means is actually when they put down the eggs, they unintentionally spread some of the parasites to those eggs. So the caterpillars will encounter the parasites, but by laying the eggs on the more medicinal plants, the caterpillars actually are less likely to become infected. And when they do become infected, they become less sick. So I think it's a great example of mommy knows best, right? And it's really the mother kind of, treating her future offspring that are going to get infected because she has the parasite, but she can give them a better chance of survival by using that medicinal milkweed.
When you first discovered this or found this, what was the process for you and those in your team in your lab and stuff, where you were able to conceptualize it as a kind of medicine, like a natural medicine? Sometimes these things, you kind of get on this by accident, or it's like, oh, well, that's interesting, or well, that actually really helps. But in terms of conceptually thinking about it in this way, what was that kind of like process like?
I think what happened is we knew that milkweeds vary in these chemicals. And historically, people have looked at this as protection against predators. So I already mentioned that these chemicals are toxic to most animals. Monarchs are resistant, and what they do, they actually take advantage of the chemicals. So they take the chemicals, put those chemicals in their own tissues, and that makes them toxic to their predators. Right? So all the ideas around these cardenolides in the milkweeds have always been tied to protection against predators. Now, I myself had grown up in a parasite lab, and I will admit I love parasites. I think they're just so intriguing, and I think they don't get the credit they deserve. And most people are just out there trying to get rid of them. But when you think about them, they have a really hard life. They have to get from one host to another. It's not easy being a parasite. But I think with that focus on parasites, I kind of view the world through the lens of parasites. And so then I think, these chemicals work against predators, but why wouldn't they work against parasites as well? Right? And so then you start thinking about these plants. A lot of plants are used for medicine by humans. And so why couldn't an animal do the same? Right? And that's kind of where that started. And so then as soon as you see that the more toxic milkweed is more medicinal for the monarch, then it's a logical question to ask, okay, does the monarch take advantage of this and actually use it as such, use it as medicine?
Yeah, it's just really, really interesting. It's always interesting. I like that, the parasite's point of view, finding the host, and it's always interesting. Maybe humans are the parasite. And the roles are somewhat reversed, right? We see them as the parasite, but maybe sometimes it's the other way around. It's nice to get the point of view of something so different from us or other similar animals. I think it's important. Chimps are interesting. They ingest this dose of a medicinal plant to reduce parasitic worms.
Yeah.
And you talked about how this was more of a rediscovery from what many traditional healers knew for a long time. What's the story here about this?
Yeah, I love the whole story about chimpanzees because it emphasizes that rediscovery, but it also emphasizes that when you look at nature with an open mind, you can discover completely interesting things. And so the story is of a primatologist called Michael Huffman, who is actually an American, but he took his education in primatology in Japan. And that's important because the Japanese primatology are very different from American and European primatology in the sense that in America and Europe, there's this cultural baggage that we have where we try to distance humans from nature very much. And that's a dualism that is really ingrained in our culture. And that means, for example, when you're doing primatology here, you tend to give your animals numbers rather than names because you don't want to anthropomorphize. You kind of look at animals as representatives of their species rather than individuals. Now, this is different in the Japanese primatology because their culture doesn't make that distinction between humans and animals. And so they have no qualms thinking about animals as having individualities and individual characters. And that's also why Japanese primatologists first showed that primates have culture, just like humans. And the other player in the story is Mohammadi Saifu Kalunde. And he worked with Mike Huffman. He was a ranger at the Tanzania National Parks, but also a traditional healer in the Watongwe community where he grew up. And so he came from a long line of traditional healers. And so they were basically doing primatology. They were studying chimpanzees. And they weren't studying medication at all to start with. They were looking at chimpanzees and trying to figure out what is the role of older chimpanzees in chimpanzee society. And then one day they noticed that one of the chimpanzees they had been following, her name was Chausiku, they noticed that she was really kind of in a bad state. She was lethargic. She had bad feces. She had dark urine. She slept during the day when they normally don't do that. She stopped looking after her infant, which then was looked after by other members of the group. And then they noticed that she went to a plant called bitterleaf. And it's a plant they don't normally use in their diet. And so she went and did a very, elaborate procedure with that plant. So she went to it, took branches off, and stripped the bark of the branches, then took the inner pith of the plant, started chewing it, sucking it, and then, swallowed the juices that came from it, spat out the rest. And so a behavior they hadn't seen before. But Mohammadi told Huffman that this is a plant that we use in traditional medicine in our community. And then Huffman thought, oh my goodness, maybe this chimpanzee is using medicine. And so that was really the first time that he thought of that. And so then what they did, they went back to the base camp and are really hoping to see the chimpanzee again the next day. And they found her again the next day. And then saw that she was slowly recovering. And at some point, she was just completely back to normal. She was running. The researchers had trouble keeping up with her. And then Mohammadi tells him, when we use it in our medicine, it usually takes 24 hours for the medicine to work. And so that's exactly the time that he saw in this chimpanzee. But it was an uphill battle because people didn't believe that wild animals got sick at the time. They didn't think that chimpanzees would use medicine. And so then the hunt was on. So one of the first things he did was figuring out what are the chemicals in these plants and found that there was chemicals that are really toxic, chemicals that have medicinal value. Then he started discovering these chimpanzees have a lot of parasitic worms. And then he finds that chimpanzees use the plant more often in the wet season when there are more worms. And then he had another observation of another chimp doing it, and then finding parasites in the feces of this chimpanzee. So putting that all together was, kind of really the first evidence from a scientific point of view that animals do this. But then to get back to the rediscovery, traditional healers already know this, because later Mohammadi told Mike Huffman, my grandfather learned medicine from porcupines and from elephants, and we look at chimpanzees. And so, for Western scientists, it was the first time or for science in general, I should say, it was the first time they discovered this medicine. But traditional healers and shamans had known it for thousands of years.
Well, it makes you wonder what other things have they known that we're rediscovering, which is
Absolutely.
interesting, which is very interesting.
Yes.
Now,
No, I mean,
to be fair,
go ahead.
there is a lot of nonsense too. I mean, so it's not like it's all wonderful things. So there's some things that are like, okay, like there are some things we know that that probably doesn't work. You can get some superstitious stuff. Okay, but
Mhm.
there are also many wonderful things from natural resources that people have been doing in certain groups or
Yeah.
tribes for a long time. So it's very really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. And oftentimes, even when you think about our modern pharmaceutical drugs, they often come from traditional medicine. Right. So, and we know that there is a lot of traditional medicine that has been proven to work. So I agree with you. There are practices out there. There is a lot of pseudoscience and things for which there is no evidence, but a lot of traditional medicine has been used for hundreds or thousands of years because it works. And we can prove that using modern scientific methods and then extract the chemicals that are responsible for the medicinal effects. And oftentimes those chemicals then end up in the drugs that we take in the form of a beautiful white pill.
Yeah. One note that you make in the book is that parasites and pathogens are different in different hosts. I remember I had a conversation with Kyle Harper, who wrote a wonderful book called Plagues Upon the Earth. It was a couple of years ago now. And I remember, I'm sure people have learned this, of course, but it was the way he described it. There's this taxonomy of 5 different kind of headings or branches. You have viruses, bacteria, fungi, protozoa. I'm forgetting the 5th one, but he organized it differently as under pathogens. How do you understand? I guess how do we you've studied parasites. How do we understand that parasites and pathogens, whichever ones they might be, are different in different hosts, and how it's going to look different in different host animals? So a parasite might look one way in humans. Maybe it's similar in chimps, maybe it's not, but it's going to be different in ants or snails or elephants or things like that. So yeah, I mean, how do parasites look different in different host animals?
Well, first of all, there is a lot of similarities, right? And so when we think about some pathogens that we are suffering from, they came from wildlife, right? So SARS-CoV-2 is a good example. We still don't know exactly what species it came from, but it jumped the species barrier. We see the same with Ebola. We have seen the same with HIV virus that came from pseudomangabes or chimpanzees, 2 different lineages of HIV. Malaria parasites we got from other primates. So there is a lot of similarities. There is, of course, also very big differences. And, what is interesting is that some parasites, you mentioned snails earlier, and of course there are parasites that have a snail host and a mammalian host. So you can think of schistosomes, also known as Bilharzia, which is it's basically a parasite that makes its living in a snail, then leaves the snail into the fresh water, then it goes into humans, and humans undergo a lot of change. The parasite changes into humans and then gets out again through the urine or the feces back into the water. So you have parasites that are really adapted to these different hosts. But yeah, then there are things that some organisms have that others don't, and a good example is the Ophiocordyceps fungi. And so these are the fungi that infect all sorts of insect species and then actually manipulate the behavior of the insect and then basically makes a mushroom-like structure that grows out of the head and that is then infecting others. I don't know if you watched any, TV shows.
This is the Last of Us. Yeah. I played the video games a long time ago, and then the show. Right. Yeah.
I watched The Last of Us on a plane ride after one of our graduate students had talked to me about it, making that analogy. And I thought, well, I guess I have to watch this.
That's good.
But yeah, so that hasn't been found in humans yet, right? Yeah. So hopefully you see big differences as well.
Isn't it also the same in the other way? Like there are things we get from other animals, but there are sometimes things that we give to other animals too. Oh, yeah. Like I think with chimps and gorillas, they can get really sick.
Yes.
From humans if we interact with them. So it's not always, you can think of I guess this is true with viruses. I don't know if it's true with parasites. Bats can hold a lot of viruses, but they can give it to, let's say, humans or other animals, but they don't get it. It's not always a reciprocal thing. It's sometimes very different, no?
Yeah, that's right. And this is exactly why you see in a lot of places now, if you go and do research on gorillas or chimpanzees, or when tourists go and check them out, right? You have to wear face masks and keep your distance because of that realization that humans can make animals sick. So it's not a one-way street.
Sure.
And actually, the damage we do to the wild species is usually way greater than what they do to us.
Yeah, yeah. So this is probably one of the most fascinating things I read in the book. I love birds. Maybe it's just me getting older or something. I don't know. I love birds, but I really got turned on to birds when I realized that they're living dinosaurs. This is basically right their lineage. And it's like, oh, we always talk about dinosaurs, and everyone wants to see a T-Rex or whatever. But I mean, birds are dinosaurs. I mean, it's incredible to when you see birds that way, they just look different. They're just totally different. We have these mini dinosaurs flying around.
Yeah, I have a colleague here at Emory who says, if you want to know what a T-Rex tasted like, just eat a chicken.
That's funny. So it's one of those things where it's like, oh, that's interesting, but they're terribly smart. So a lot of them, and the behavior here in the book, I had to read it twice. I couldn't believe it. So you're talking about this process birds go through, a very meticulous process where they'll collect cigarette butts and place them in their nests.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's one researcher in particular. It's this woman you highlight. Kind of give her her due of her research she did. How does this work? How does this happen? I found that fascinating. Why are they doing this? Why is it so meticulous? Talk about a little bit of this research. It's fascinating.
Yeah, I find it very exciting myself, and I think it's personally, I think it's one of my favorite parts of the book. Also, because I went to Mexico City to talk to Montse Suarez Rodriguez, who did most of this research, and so it was so nice to see what was going on, but also because it seems so counterintuitive, right? So here we are, humans are discarding these cigarette butts, and really what we're talking about is the filters of these cigarettes. So you're done smoking and then discard the last bit with the filter. Turns out that people are really bad at taking care of their cigarette butts, so they just litter them into the environment. And then to know that that can actually be helpful was very surprising to me as well. But yeah, so the story there is that in Mexico City at UNAM, which is the big National Autonomous University of Mexico, the research there was really done about the effect of urbanization. So as nature gets replaced by cities and everything becomes more city-like, what does that do to wildlife?
Nice. Yeah.
And so Montse was really interested in understanding how does this affect the nest building of birds when they live in these cities, kind of expecting that these nests are going to have all sorts of rubbish in them that could actually be bad for the chicks. They could get tangled into string and plastic and all sorts of things. So they were doing research and then started discovering all this white fluff in the bird nest, and they didn't really know what it was. And it was not until it rained that she smelled the smoke and realized, oh, maybe these are cigarette butts. And so it's not like the birds just collect them and dump them in their nest as is. They go through this ritual where they really pull out the white fibers and then line their nest with those. So it becomes like this kind of this fluffy layer around the nest. And until it's wet and you smell the smoke, you just can't see what it is. And she had some trouble persuading her advisor when she went to tell him. So his name, Constantino Macias Garcia, and said, hey, these are cigarette butts. And he said, no, I just see white fibers. And then she made it wet and then he could smell it too. And then what she found is that when you look across a lot of nests, and so these are nests of house finches and house sparrows that live in Mexico City, and they found that if the nest has more of the cigarette butts, then they have fewer parasites. And these are blood-sucking parasites, ectoparasites, such as mites and lice and things like that. And so that was really intriguing, right? Because more cigarette butts, fewer parasites. But that, of course, raises the question, is this actually medication? So do the birds actually do this on purpose? So we get back to that intentionality that we started with. Or is it just accident. They put this in there because it's nice and fluffy, and a benefit is that an unintended benefit is that it gets rid of parasites. But then they did an experiment where they had these nests and then replaced the lining of the nest with an artificial lining that she made, and then they either added live blood-sucking ticks to the nest. So these are ticks like you and I get when we go into the forest. And so these ticks suck the blood of the chicks, or they added ticks that had been killed. And then what they found is that the birds from those nests started collecting more cigarette butts when they had the live ticks than when they had the dead ticks. And so what that really showed is that when these birds perceive that there are parasites that are a threat to their chicks, and they really start sucking on the blood of their chicks, they start collecting more of the cigarette butts. And then they showed that it helps the chicks, so the chicks have a better survival. But not all is rosy, because there's also side effects of this. And so when the chicks are exposed to these cigarette butts, which have nicotine, which is, of course, a very important chemical, and that evolved to kill all sorts of insects and other arthropods. That's why plants have it in the first place. But there's other chemicals. Through the process of smoking, you get a lot of really nasty chemicals as well. And so you start seeing that these birds also have some blood abnormalities. So, and that also kind of hammers home the whole idea of medicine. There's benefits, but there's also costs. And, when we take medicine and you read the whole leaflet that comes with it, sometimes you think, I'm lucky if I'm not going to die.
Right.
And so, but you see the same with animals. And so this is a great example. They use these cigarette butts. It helps, but there's also costs associated with it.
This is a exhibit A of why we need people people need to be in good places, good institutions, that get good funding to do good research, because there's so many things we can learn about for certain animals, but obviously we're all connected. This is so important. Who would have thought? Who would have thought?
I couldn't agree more. And I would go a step further. And I think that what it really shows is that we can benefit from funding curiosity-driven research, right? Yeah. Because none of these researchers, that the researchers study chimpanzees, the researchers study the birds. My own research, none of us would have foreseen that we would discover that these animals use medicine. But once you do, there's all sorts of applications. And that's really the power of basic science. You don't know what you're going to get, but you do know you're going to get something.
That's right. And I do like curiosity-based kind of research. I think that's usually the best. People are very eager, very earnest. That's great. Mm-hmm. Tell us about ants. Obviously, ants are fascinating in their own way. They use resin to create the walls and passageways of their hills, and they also can medicate with it as well. How does this work? It's got multifunctional usage.
Yeah, well, and that's the interesting thing, because when you look at, so in the book I talk about wood ants, and so these make massive nests in the Jura Mountains in Switzerland. And what researchers had noticed, and actually noticed for hundreds of years, that oftentimes they contain large amounts of the resin, so the sticky stuff that trees produce as a defense for themselves, protection against wounds or against insects. And, so then the question is, well, what is it for? Is it just a building material, or is it doing something else? And so researchers at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland have been studying this for a long time. And what they discovered is that the resin is antimicrobial. And so when the ants incorporate it into their nest, it actually takes care of bacterial and viral and fungal infections, really reduces those. And they also find that the ants collect more of it. And so this brings us back, is it therapy or is it prophylaxis? They actually start collecting a lot more of it during the breeding season. And when they have babies in the nest that are really sensitive to all sorts of infectious diseases, that's when they collect a lot more of it. And what's interesting is that people have actually known about resin for a long time and used it as medicine for hundreds of years, at least. But somehow, you see it in an ant's nest and people say, I don't know what that's for. Well, maybe it's medicine. And that's exactly what these researchers found.
I find this part of the book that you cover really, really interesting. And I'm sure you I mean, I'm sure there have been people that have written books on this. I'm sure you could have. I'm sure. I'm sure there were many chapters. Probably the one on butterflies, because that's your research and stuff. That could have been very long. So credit to all the editors that were helping you and to yourself for getting these very condensed chapters, with all the good stuff. But tell us about this co-evolutionary process between plants and insects, and how many natural emitting chemicals from plants and fungi impact other multicellular organisms, including mammals like us. I found that really complicated, really complex, and really fascinating. But tell us the co-evolutionary story here. I think that's really important.
Yeah, I think that story is really to try to explain why is there medicine in the first place, right? Because so far we have talked about ants using resin, and birds using nicotine, and chimpanzees using the toxins of this bitter leaf, butterflies using cardinalides in milkweeds. Why do these plants have all that stuff in the first place? And the reason for that is their co-evolutionary arms race. So, when we think about arms races, I don't know about you, but I grew up in the early 1980s in the Netherlands. So the first time I was aware of arms races was really the Cold War, which kind of intensified in the early 1980s, but then culminated or kind of stopped with the tearing down of the Berlin Wall in 1989. And so that idea of, the US and their allies producing one nuclear weapon, and then the Soviet Union producing a better one, which then asked for the response to produce an even better one by the US and their allies, and so on. So this is a continuous process. And so this has happened in nature over and over and over again. So co-evolution and these arms races are very common in nature. So when you think about a plant, so you think about an early plant in the early stages of evolution, a plant is good food for an animal, but if the plant gets eaten, that's bad news for the plant, because the plant then doesn't reproduce, doesn't leave offspring, so it reduces its fitness. On the other hand, the insect or other herbivore that's trying to eat the plant, if the plant becomes toxic and it cannot eat it, that's bad news for the insect, because then it cannot survive and reproduce. So what you start seeing is that plants start evolving these toxins, and then insects start evolving. Insects, other herbivores as well, mammalian herbivores as well, they start evolving this resistance. And so then the plants evolve greater toxicity, the herbivores increase their resistance. And so this keeps on going over and over and over and over again. It never ends. So it's like you never get ahead, right? But you keep on evolving, but you never get ahead. And so that's resulted in a huge diversity, because these co-evolutionary arms races happen for different pairs or groups of plants and their herbivores, also mushrooms and their herbivores or predators, I should say. And so what that means is that you just got this huge diversity of all these co-evolutionary arms races, resulting in this huge diversity of all sorts of really toxic chemicals. Right? And once those are there, then animals can start using them as medicine, because then and that's the other intriguing thing, right? So you think about the resin on trees, the plants evolved it because it helps them against infections and attacks by herbivores. They didn't evolve it so that the ants could take advantage of it, right? It so happens the ants learned or evolved the ability to use it, and it helps them, so they're using it. The same with drugs that we use, right? So when we take an anti-malarial drug, it didn't evolve for that reason. It evolved for a completely different reason, but we take advantage of it. But so it's that kind of pushing the different organisms. The organisms are pushing each other to the extreme, more and more resistance, more and more toxicity. And that has given us this huge pharmacy of toxic chemicals.
When you explain it that way, it does sort of tell us as humans and other animals how much we can still learn and what we can still kind of grow to having things from the natural world helping us to, find good solutions of how to maybe not necessarily cure things, but how to maybe alleviate some things, which I think that's the big lesson here. This is still, in some ways, the planet is a big laboratory. So
yes, and that research has been going for 3.8 billion years.
That's right. Yeah. This was interesting. So domesticated animals, mostly on farms, goats and sheep.
Mhm.
Okay, again, not all of them are domesticated, but we know them as such, often enough, for better or for worse. Um, you talk about how they make positive and negative associations between
Mhm.
foods and gut feelings.
Yeah.
So that will give them preferences and avoidances. Um, I guess talk about that research and how that was discovered, because that's very, very interesting, specifically with these animals that are often, not always, but domesticated.
Yeah. Yeah. And first of all, domesticated animals are often frowned upon
Hmm.
by humans because people tend to think of them as being stupid.
Mm.
And the idea being that, we took wild animals and then selected for traits that are useful for us. But when you look at our domestic animals, there's no way they could survive in nature. And that's definitely true. When I look at my miniature poodle, he's great in a lot of ways, but he's not going to make it out there when he's competing with wolves, right? So, but I think what that has done is that it's given a lot of people the impression that they have lost all their natural abilities for a lot of things, and that includes medicine.
Mm.
And so the research that I talk about in terms of sheep and goats, really beautiful work that was done by Fred Provenza and Juan Villalba at Utah State University.
Mm.
And they, it kind of started when Provenza was, so this was back in the 1970s when he was starting to look at goats in particular areas and discovered that what he thought was really good food for them, they just wouldn't touch. It's like, well, this is green and it's fresh. Why are you not eating this? And then eventually you figured out it's because they had really bad chemicals that are really not nice for the goats. So they avoided it. They didn't want to eat it. So they learn, when they eat this, they don't feel good. So they start avoiding it.
Mm.
But then on the flip side, when these goats and sheep and other animals are, say, infected with a worm, and then they could actually eat that same plant that they had been avoiding, and then they get relief from those parasites. Now they have learned that when they feel sick, then they use it and they start feeling better.
Mm.
So you basically go from a plant that is avoided to one that is chosen when they need it, when they're sick. And so these animals are extremely good at making those associations. And and those associations can be made, after a few hours. It doesn't have to be immediate. Sometimes it's 24 or 48 hours that these animals can make these associations. And then the intriguing thing is that they don't actually have to be conscious of their choices. It's basically their guts telling them what they're doing. And this has been shown when you anesthetize animals and you give them particular chemicals and then you give them an infusion of sugar or not. And then their body just has made that association in the future. And I think that's very intriguing. I think there's a lot of parallels where actually maybe it's not that surprising.
Mm.
And so when you think about associations that we make as humans that are often also not conscious, or where actually our consciousness cannot get rid of them. And that's, I find, one of the most intriguing things.
Mm.
And, you think about food poisoning, or I think one of the most intriguing examples is chemotherapy against cancer, something that I learned when writing this book. I didn't know this, but, people that do chemotherapy and they get really sick. And so then they start making this negative association with the food that they ate the night before. And that food can be pancakes, it can be chocolate, it can be, pizza, it can be things that normally people would love. And even though they know it wasn't the food that made them sick, it was the chemotherapy, they cannot eat that food again. Their body screams no at them, even when their brain tells them, but I know it wasn't the chocolate.
Mm.
And so I think that's a really good example of showing that, a lot of the associations that animals and we make are not conscious. And in fact, sometimes that consciousness cannot even override it. So it is really the way that our gut essentially interacts with our brain. And that is how the body can learn these associations. So you can learn what to eat when you're sick, and then next time use it again when you feel those symptoms.
It's reminding me of a long time ago. I had a conversation with she does like comparative biology, She also does some neuroscience. Is Lori Marino, and she works with whales and dolphins, a lot of social mammals in the water. But she wrote a great article, which is what caught my attention. I'm forgetting the outlet at the moment. Entitled "Eating Someone," and in that article, she really talked about how domesticated farm animals have potentially consciousness. They're highly intelligent, but they have some consciousness. And there's obviously ethical implications, and people that are vegetarian or vegan, will really kind of stake their claim here on this stuff and say, look, we shouldn't be doing this. But and people can have that debate. But either way, this idea, kind of what you're getting at, is you don't even have to be. I mean, of course, it would be interesting if it was, but these associations that farmed animals can have on preferences or avoidances tells you that something is going on within these animals that is more than just. It's not like they don't have brains, in their body. They're and it's not just herding around and kind of dumb. I mean, they're highly aware of things and aware of their body, aware of what's going in. The consciousness thing. Who knows? It's an interesting discussion, but there is some intelligence there. They are problem solving in some way, and it's very fascinating to think about this.
Yeah, and I think it really emphasizes the expression "listen to your gut."
That's right.
Sometimes that's actually what we do. One thing that's really intriguing is that quite recently I saw a paper come out in Current Biology, and that showed that jellyfish can learn as well. So they did experiments where the jellyfish bump into little obstacles, and the jellyfish learn not to do that again. Right? Jellyfish don't have a brain.
Right.
They have kind of this peripheral nervous system where they have, they have ganglia around their body, but they don't have a centralized brain. So that shows already you can learn without a brain.
Yeah, this is in humans. This was in the 90s, a paper, Andy Clark and oh my gosh, I am drawing a blank on the other author's name. It will come to me. Chalmers, I believe it's Chalmers. They wrote about this whole extended mind kind of idea, right? That your mind isn't just in your brain and your head; you're in your body too. And we know this from other multicellular organisms like fungi that also have some element of intelligence and of knowing, awareness. And there's been great researchers, Nikki Clayton, Alex Schnell, that have done all the work with cephalopods and looking at the differences between learning, associative learning, certain behaviors, intelligence, consciousness. So it's all super important and super relevant.
Yeah.
Let me ask about elephants. You say that they have been able to show us that there are some medicinal qualities of plants that were unknown to humans, and how there was this kind of almost we were in their kind of classroom of sorts. They were giving us a seminar on all these things.
Yeah.
And in some ways,
yeah.
What was the kind of discovery here about how they were able to show us this?
Yeah, so elephant educators.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so there's actually multiple stories. So I mentioned earlier Mohammadi, who worked with Mike Huffman, and his grandfather had discovered a new way of treating stomach upset by witnessing an elephant. So what he saw was an elephant that had a sore stomach, and then went to a particular tree, took the leaves, and basically mixed the leaves in its mouth with water. So it made a concoction. And then the healer copied that behavior, and that's a treatment that gets used regularly in Tanzania. And then there are other examples when you look at Southeast Asia, where you have these really close interactions between elephants and their caregivers called mahouts. And so they really learn from each other a lot of different things. And so the people who care for the elephants, on the one hand, they've learned so much about what the elephants need when they are sick with something or they're deficient in something, so that they can take the elephant to a place where they know the elephant can find the particular plants they need. But even so, even today, when you look at the reports that the mahouts give about what their elephants eat, even today there are discoveries where you see the elephants using plants for which we didn't even know yet that there was medicinal properties. Because for sometimes the science works in such a way that you see an elephant doing something like, oh, maybe it's using it as medicine. And it makes sense because humans have used this for a long time. But in some cases, we didn't know. And so, so even now we're discovering new plants and people starting to use that as well. And then, it's actually that there is so much respect for elephants about knowing how to maintain their health that people learn from that they sometimes, even when they see elephants eat their own dung, and humans will copy that as well. And part of the idea there is, there's microbes, but obviously it's also a whole pharmacy of the medicinal plants that the elephants have been using. And for that kind of thing, we need to do the science really to see, is it safe and does it really help? But what it does show is that people really take a lot of stock in what the elephants do, and that elephants still discovered plants that we didn't even know had medicinal properties.
Yeah, that's what's so cool about that fact is that they're discovering things that not even we're discovering, and we can learn a lot from, which makes, again, to emphasize the point, that's why people need to do this kind of curious research to see what we've maybe been missing, kind of there all along.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So for house pets, I'm sure listeners will be very fond of these chapters in the book. Dogs and cats, you talk about how they eat grass, which anybody that's been an owner or lived with dogs or cats have seen this. I've seen this with my cats. I can think of one cat in particular we used to have, and he'd go outside and he would enjoy himself and run around and look at all the birds and kind of roll around, and then sometimes he just bolt outside and just start eating grass. I'm like, what the hell are you doing, man? Why are you eating the grass? Thankfully, we're careful that there's no, pesticides, things like that.
Yeah.
But I never, you look this stuff up online and, there's, kind of, a million reasons and ideas, don't really know what's what. And I was like, okay, well, I'm not going into the, animal behavior journals to look this up. But so I remember in your book and reading it, I was just like, oh, that's so interesting. So tell us some of the reasons why cats and dogs, they eat grass. It seems strange, but it's they all do it in some sort of intuitively. What's the story here?
Yeah, so it was a question I got when I started telling people that I was going to write this book. They said, oh, you're going to talk about dogs and eating grass. And I said, yeah, I will. And I will say, I was actually really disappointed with how little research has been done on it. So we know a lot more about ants and butterflies and chimpanzees than we know about our dogs and our cats. Really, really surprising. So there are very few studies that have looked at grass eating in dogs. And so some of these studies were experiments, some of them were kind of surveys, and inconclusive. So yes, well, first of all, dogs eat grass. They do it. So do cats. People notice it. But then, what is the effect of it? It's all over the place. So some people notice that their dogs vomit afterwards. Right. And certainly I can see my own dogs do that as well.
Yeah. Cats can too. I've seen them also throw, not a lot, but a little bit. Yeah, it's a regurgitation.
That's right. But yeah, the scientific studies on it are quite limited. But what I found interesting is that when you think about, so dogs and cats are both part of the carnivores, so a group of animals that mostly eats meat, right? There's exceptions because the giant panda is part of the carnivores and eats bamboo almost exclusively. But really what these animals have in common is that they're meat eaters, right? The carnivores. But then when you start looking across, there was a beautiful paper that put together all we know about grass eating in the carnivores across all the different species. And you find it's really common. So you find it in wolves, and you find it in tigers, and you find it in mountain lions, and you find it in bears. So a lot of different animals do this. And then when you start looking through it and say, well, what is the most likely reason they do it? So people find that when they eat grass, it's usually grass that's really rough in structure. It's grass that sometimes goats even avoid. And so the cliche is always that goats eat anything, which isn't true. But, so it's kind of surprising. Okay, even a goat is not eating. So why would this carnivore eat it? And then people find often they're tracking their animals, that when they see the feces, they see the grass together with parasitic worms in the feces. And so what that's really suggested is that these animals do this to get rid of parasites from their guts. It's very similar to what chimpanzees do in a different form of medication that we have mentioned before. A lot of chimpanzees will swallow really rough leaves when they are sick with parasites, when they have worms in their guts. And what they do is they don't digest the leaf, they fold it up and swallow it. And then what it does, it basically catches parasites in the intestinal tract, and it irritates the intestines so that they have diarrhea and get rid of these parasites. And so it seems that our domestic dogs and cats have this behavior as a relic of their wild ancestors that did this as a way to get rid of parasites. When I see my dogs doing it, I let them.
Yeah, what is it with grass, though, that's getting rid of the parasites? Is there something with the makeup of grass, or?
Yes. Yeah, I don't know if you ever have pulled grass, and sometimes you can get, it's not a paper cut, but it feels like a paper cut.
Yeah, that's right.
Grass is really rough and really hard. So it has a lot of silica in it. It often has really rough leaves on it. So it's a really good scouring mechanism. And so that's why we think the animals use it.
Kind of connected to that, you also mentioned catnip for cats, which is also very interesting. I mean, it's almost like they're getting high. I mean, they have this this euphoria. You talk about them, breaking open, I guess, natural catnip. They're just kind of breaking open certain pieces of it. They rub themselves on it. Maybe it helps them with mosquitoes. I mean, what's going on with cat? I mean, they go nuts for it, and it seems like it's just absolute euphoria. Like they just took some psilocybin, or they took some ecstasy. I mean, it's quite hilarious to see what's going on with cats and the catnip.
Yeah, and so cats do this, and a lot of people know it, right? Because you can buy catnip in the pet store, and you can buy all sorts of toys that are impregnated with chemicals from catnip. Yeah, so the cats, like you said, they go basically delirious when they have this catnip or these toys. They start rolling around and salivating. And so really beautiful research that was done in Japan by Reiko Uniyama and Masao Miyazaki. And what they were always fond of cats and really interested in why do cats do this. And they actually looked at silvervine, which is very similar to catnip. And what they discovered is that the cats really seem to do it to coat themselves in chemicals. And so some of the experiments they did was, when the plant is on the ground, the cats start rolling around it. But then they took the chemicals off the silvervine, put it on a filter paper, and then put it at the top of a cage. And then they saw that the cats would still touch their head against it, but they were no longer rolling around. So the rolling around isn't just something they do when they smell it. They really try to get more and more of that stuff on their fur. And what they hypothesized was they do this, as an anointing strategy. So they coat themselves in chemicals, and maybe this helps against mosquitoes. So what the researchers did, they extracted chemicals from the silvervine and then put them in different fractions. And they found one particular chemical that was really repellent to mosquitoes. And so they could demonstrate this, taking that chemical, putting it on cats, and then seeing, putting cats on a cage and find that the cat with the chemicals didn't get as many mosquito bites. They felt really bad about what they did. So the researchers then decided, okay, we're going to smear the chemicals on us as well, and then we're going to go to the mosquito cage, and they showed the same thing. So you put the chemical on the human, and it keeps the mosquitoes away as well. And then they did experiments. They looked at an Amur leopard and some other wild cats that in zoos, and found that the cats did the same thing. So it suggests that these cats have had this response for millions of years. And, when you think about what are real big threats to cats in the wild, well, they don't have many predators, but they do have parasites. And mosquitoes are a real big problem for them because they transmit all sorts of really nasty parasites, such as heartworm, that a lot of cat owners will know about. And so by using these plants, they essentially coat themselves in these chemicals and keep those mosquitoes away.
It's like a natural off repellent for cats.
Yeah, and the researchers have now patented the chemical to see if we can develop it into a human repellent, right? Wow. So it's another great example of curiosity-driven research love cats, want to know what they're doing, but hey, maybe we have the best mosquito repellent ever thanks to our cats right now.
It still doesn't explain, I guess, the kind of seemingly euphoric kind of behavior they have with it, though. I mean, they're rolling around in it, but they do seem to get kind of nuts.
They love it. Yeah.
They love it. Yeah,
but,
right.
but I think that actually explains, so the way evolution works is, it basically works, if you want to talk about that, to get the job done, right? So, and I think a great analogy is, reproduction. When you think about, let's make it very personal. To think about humans, reproducing, having sex is fun, right? So yes, the biological function is to reproduce, but if it wasn't fun, people wouldn't do it, right? So you can think about the same for cats. It's like, if the function is to repel mosquitoes, how do you get the cat to do it? So the hormonal system is essentially rewarding these cats for this behavior. So they keep on doing it. They love it. They don't know that it's going to help against mosquitoes. They just know they love it. So they keep on doing it. But the cats that do it, therefore get fewer mosquito bites, fewer parasites. They're the ones that survive. They're the ones that have offspring. And if that's a genetic trait, right, that makes them love this stuff, then they pass that on to their offspring. So it's basically evolution just using a tool to get the cat what it needs.
And it is very interesting. I think that cats, especially for whatever reason, they've been around humans for a long time. They live in our house. I mean, I have 3 cats, so they live with us. And there's not much different with house cats with wild cats. Jonathan Losos wrote this book on cats a couple years ago, and we talked about it. And he was like, "I love cats. I did all this research, and there's still big question marks over all the things we see them do in our house all the time. There's just so many things we don't know what they're doing."
Exactly.
And they've been around us for so long. And like you're saying, we know more about what ants are doing, and it's like, cats are fascinating to me. They really, really are fascinating behavior-wise.
Yeah, the research in Japan said, the cat is a very mysterious animal. And that's why they're so intrigued by them.
Right, and I think that's why we like them, because we can't quite figure them out. They're not fully domesticated, and it's, what are they up to? So, have you ever seen those ones where they put like the GoPros on their collar, and you just see like their patterns going around like a town or a city? Makes no sense. It's all in a zigzag pattern. They're just going about. They fall over. Like there's no rhyme or reason to it. Seemingly, it's very interesting.
Seemingly, right?
Right. Seemingly,
until we figure it out.
Until we figure it out, and it's like, oh, that's the whole point, right? Or whatever.
Yeah. It's like the same with the cat. And why are they drooling all over this plant? And well, it seems that it helps them.
Yeah. It's really, really cool. So, final question here: how can humans continue to protect nature, to allow animals to protect themselves? By caring for their own ailments, and how we can still learn from them on how to do that.
Yeah, I think the most important thing is to give animals a choice, right? So much of what the book is about, and all the examples that I described of how animals choose between different plants or find specific compounds, or, it can be animals, it can be fungi, it can be the resin from trees. We tend to think of animals as needing shelter and food. And that's important, but they also need medicine, right? And so that means an animal actually needs a lot more resources than we used to think, because it's not just food and it's not just shelter. So they need to have this whole pharmacy basically to thrive. And so I think that, it only adds to the call for protecting nature and protecting that biodiversity. I think there's also a selfish element to that, because there are still so many undiscovered medicines out there that we as humans can benefit from. And it's not just that there's a lot of undiscovered medicines, there's also a lot of undiscovered pharmacists out there. So many animals out there that are using medicine that we don't know yet. But by studying them, we can really get an advantage by getting new drugs for us, right? Because whenever we use drugs against infectious diseases, that the parasites and pathogens evolve resistance. So we're always on the lookout for new drugs and medicines. And so I think, preserving nature so that the animals can keep on doing their medicine, but we can keep on learning from them, I think is really important.
Yeah, wholeheartedly agree. Well, this was so much fun. I greatly appreciate you coming on and telling us all of these wonderful, wonderful things about the natural world and about animals in it and our cohabitation and coexistence with many of these animals. I hope that you continue to do your research, keep writing more books and giving us all the information we need. So big thanks for coming on and talking all about it.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. My pleasure.